Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're going over another upgrade on a speaker that a customer sent in. This time a JBL speaker, the model LSR6332. Now in this situation the customer is trying to use them as home theater speakers, using them as a center, left, right, and surround speakers, and wanted me to see what I could do with these things. So he sent one in and we dug into this thing, and yeah, it was a bit of a mess. There's some issues. Let's first take a look at the box. The box has some type of a composite front face. It's almost feels like an injection molded plastic baffle. I don't know what's going on there. It's not very thick. It has one brace going from here, going all the way to the back, and in the back it meets a little brace that goes across the back of the speaker, but then the brace stops before it reaches the side. So it doesn't brace the sides, and it only slightly braces the back. And I'm thinking, what are they thinking? This is a big box, and the rest of it is just MDF, and there's no bracing in it. So that was kind of messed up. And at one point we started sending sine waves through it at different frequencies, where we would start at like 30 hertz and go up to several hundred hertz. And at a certain frequency, whenever we hit the resonant frequency of one of the panels, boy, did it light up. I mean, there was vibrations coming off of this thing like crazy. Then at a different resonant frequency, the top would vibrate. I remember being behind the speaker with it aimed out at the microphone, and I was sitting back there running the computer, hitting different frequencies, different wavelengths that I'm sending this thing, and there were a couple of times where it suddenly got really loud behind the speaker, and that's because the whole back of the speaker was resonating. It's a mess. Now this mid-tweeter pod here can be undone and twisted around, so you could lay the speaker on its side or something. You can spin this whole thing around and screw it back in, and then behind the mid there's a cup there that separates its airspace from the rest. Now it's got dual binding posts on the back, all gold coated, everything looks nice, but of course on the other side it's got steel screws. And then in the tweeter circuit there's a little adjustment here where you can unscrew a little plate and move it over to the next notch to change the output level of the tweeter, and that has steel screws on every one of them. So the last thing you want in the signal path going to your tweeter, a bunch of steel screws. So not really sure what they were thinking on this one. Driver quality, the tweeter was pretty good. The woofer was fine if you use it within its range. The mid was quite the mess. I like the look of the woofer. The woofer has a nice frame. It is a very ringy frame. I don't know if this is really a cast frame. It looks like it's cast, but it's very thin, like a stamped steel frame. It looks like they punched it and rolled it, and then it has this huge vent. It's not really a vent. It has this huge heat sink on the motor structure, and the actual magnet is only about this tall and just a couple of inches in diameter. So maybe a nice strong neodymium magnet. It makes it lightweight, and it's a paper-based cone. I like paper-based cones. The mid also paper-based cone. Parts quality on the inside, poor to poor. Yeah, pretty bad. A lot of iron core inductors, a lot of electrolytic capacitors, all sandcast resistors. There are a few caps in there that are, let me look at it real quick, maybe polypropylene in a couple of them, probably polyester film. Yeah, not exactly a high-end speaker. Would it work in home theater application? Yeah, but it's going to be noisy. And the frequency response was rough. There were some issues there too. Let's take a look at the on-tweeter axis frequency response and note that it's a little choppy. And right there at 1 kHz there's a peak, and at that peak there's some stored energy. There's a little bit of ringing going on all across the range of this thing. And the best response we could get was actually 4 inches below the tweeter axis, which was just almost in line with the mid. And here's that frequency response. It stays pretty smooth within a range, but the problem is some of those peaks there have stored energy. Let's look at the spectral decay, and we can see that there's quite a bit of ringing going on. Some of it has to do with some of the surface reflection off of the baffle, and some of it in the woofer may be the fact that they barely even put any insulation in there. That it's just a really light, thin strip that's stapled onto the sides of the cabinet. If they would have actually put some good fiberglass insulation in there, it might have done away with some of that down low. The other major problem with this speaker is the impedance. Let's have a look at the impedance curve. Down around 100 hertz range, or just below 100 hertz, I guess at 91 hertz, it dropped to 2.5 ohms down there at the end where it's really going to be drawing some current. So bad news for any of you guys trying to hook these up to a bunch of home theater receivers. It's going to suck those things dry. Some of those receivers aren't going to like it at all. And then way up here at about 1400 hertz, it actually drops to 2 ohms. So this speaker is not for all amplifiers. The way they have this thing configured, there's a lot of parts there in shunt that are allowing power to go back to the amplifier, and it's causing it quite an impedance dip there. You need an amp that's 2 ohm stable to drive the speaker. Also, as far as the parts are concerned, there were 24 parts on this thing. So they put some parts on it trying to correct the response. Did they correct it? No, not really. Let's look at some of the off-axis responses on this thing. And because it's an asymmetrical design, we looked at the off-axis going in both directions. And we looked at it not only going up, but looked at it going down. Let's start by looking at the horizontal off-axis going towards the drivers. And it falls off relatively normal. I'm not seeing anything bad in the horizontal off-axis. Going horizontal in the opposite direction towards the port looks a little smoother. It actually has a really good response dropping off in that direction. Going up vertically, when we're on tweeter axis and moving up, we can see a pretty good little dip starts around 2 kHz. Right at that crossover point, they're starting to cause some cancellation. Going down, not too bad. As we start going down, I took a few measurements as I could going that way. Not too bad in that direction. And then, of course, since this thing can be rotated, we can rotate this thing and measure it in that other configuration, which measured a little bit better in that configuration. Let's look at the on-axis response. And notice it has a nice average, but those peaks are still an issue. And let's look at the spectral decay, and we can see a little bit of stored energy there where those peaks are. Looking at the crossover response on this thing, you can see that the mid cross is fairly low to the woofer. Right below 300 hertz, around 275, 280. That's right about where they cross. And that's a good idea to allow this thing to cross it at a lower frequency range and let this thing play on down as low as it can. That improves things quite a bit in some areas. With it in that twisted configuration there with this rotated, let's look at the vertical off-axis. Looks a little bit better in that regard. And then what we did, horizontal off-axis going towards the woofer. And we did horizontal off-axis going towards the port, which was going away from the speaker. And I really didn't see too much in the horizontal. And only on the one going towards the woofer did it look a little bit choppy. But overall, this one was a handful. Let's start by looking at the raw tweeter response. Now the tweeter's response, as it goes down in frequency, it goes up. In other words, that tweeter's response starts ramping up, but that's not a problem. I can pull that whole thing down and flatten it out. And let's look at the spectral decay for the tweeter at the same time, and notice it's fairly clean. So we're good on the tweeter end. It's where we get into the mid and the woofer where we see all that stored energy. Let's look at the measured frequency response of the mid, and let's compare that with the spectral decay. As you can see, there's definitely some issues going on there. That big peak at 1 kHz is a problem. That's a big problem there. And that's going to be an area where you're going to hear a lot of brightness. That's right at the upper harmonics of the vocal region. up at the top of female vocals, that's where you're going to hear that just, oh man, that's a bad place for a peak. Then let's look at the woofer's response and the spectral decay on the woofer. Notice a humongous peak going on around 2100 hertz. A lot of stored energy right there. So the usable range of this woofer is definitely below 600 or 700 hertz. I wouldn't want to push it any higher than that. So it definitely needs a slope that pulls it down and keeps it down in the range that they use this thing. So really had my work cut out for me on this. Trying to create the control that the drivers need and trying to not make the impedance any worse was a bit of a challenge. And I used on the mid an inline, a series type notch filter to correct that big peak at 1K hertz, and that worked out pretty well. Let's look at the crossover response, and you can see the ranges that I've got these drivers within, and how much smoother the response is now. And let's look at the on-axis response by itself, which is right at the tweeter axis, and then let's go down. I took some measurements all over the place in this thing. Halfway between the tweeter and the mid is where it had its smoothest response. It's flat as a pancake through that region. I mean, I got a super accurate response. And if we look at the spectral decay, you'll notice that I've tamed some of that stored energy there. I've damped the big one out that was right at 1K hertz. There's still some energy there, but it's not as bad as it was. And some of that stuff above that region is actually surface reflections from the front of this baffle, because you can see how the lines there from the drivers drop off pretty smoothly, and then as it comes down a little further in amplitude, you'll see those little wiggles tracing out there. Those are secondary reflections off of the baffle. Now here's a big thing that I really improved it a lot in this category. Let's look at the new impedance curve, and you'll notice from the crossover that I put on it, I was able to keep the impedance up above, really above 5 ohms. It dipped to 4.7 ohms right at 100 hertz, and then up there where it dips the second time, it only dips to 5 ohms. So now you can derive it with pretty much anything. Even some of your home theater receivers, if they're rated for 4 ohm loads, won't have a problem with it now, whereas before it was probably really choking on this thing. So lastly, let's just look at the off-axis response. Let's look at it going away from the drivers, and it looks perfect fall away in the off-axis response. And then the horizontal response going towards the drivers, and again, it looks good in that direction as well. Vertical off-axis going up, it keeps the drivers in phase over a pretty good range there until you get about 8 to 12 inches above the tweeter level at 1 meter, which is pretty high up, and you can see the drivers are going to start to cancel a little bit there. And then going down, we see it maintains good phase going down, and it starts to get the mid and the woofer a little out of phase as you go down. So vertically, you definitely have a window there that you want to stay within so that everything arrives in time and in phase. So putting together a little parts package for this thing, my crossover only required 14 parts. So think about that for a minute. I know you guys are always on me saying, oh, you think you know better than all the engineers that work for JBL and all the resources they have. And let's take a look again at what they did with 24 crossover parts. Let's throw up the frequency response on axis, on tweeter axis, and let's compare that with the on-axis response that I was able to create with only 14 parts. And I can guarantee you the package we're going to put together, the parts quality is going to be a whole lot better than this garbage that's in this speaker right now. We're going to go with all good quality coils from US Coils. We're going to have JB poly caps and may even do some Sonicap options in the tweeter circuit for those of you who want to take it to the highest level. We're going to use good quality resistors that are not sandcast resistors. We're going to replace those binding posts with a set of tube connectors. We're going to give you some good quality wire instead of this PVC coated stuff, and no push on connectors. And we're going to give you enough sheets, no res, to go through this thing and control those resonances. If you guys take all this apart, take that crossover out of there, take this panel out, go in and add a few little braces through this thing just to stiffen it up, and then line it with no reza all over. Going to transform the bass response and the vocal region of this thing completely, because you're going to do away with all those resonances that are masking everything in this speaker. So just that alone is going to be a huge improvement in everything. So check it out online. I haven't totaled up all the pricing on this thing yet. I just finished it up a few days ago, and we'll have everything put together, a nice little package for you. For all of you guys who have these things and you want to fix these and turn them into a accurate measuring speaker that actually sounds good, we're gonna help you do that. So that's it for this video. I appreciate you guys watching. Please hit the subscribe button if you haven't, and we'll see you in the next video.